Hiya, my name's Phil. I like to discuss politics, and I had recently a little question, a bit of a suggestion on one of the videos. I'll just read it through really quickly. It says, I had a bit of an idea I thought I'd throw you away. I was wondering if you'd have time to give an overview or something I felt would be of benefit to subscribers who might not be politics buffs. It seems to me that every outcome is going to create major disagreements, of course, talking about Brexit, and divide. And this is indicative to not only the party in power, I think that means, but British politics on the whole in her current state. I commented below that it feels like the fireworks finale to a show that was in the making for years. It absolutely is. So it'd be fantastic if you could go give your opinion on where you felt this all began to go wrong, because this clearly didn't happen overnight. In your opinion, where the history of British politics is concerned, what moments in time set the wheels in motion for the clear divide we see today? I would hazard a guess things that occurred decades ago had a part to play in the chaos we are now seeing, whereby any Brexit outcome will cause uproar, blah, blah, blah. And absolutely. And where it really stems from is not so much British politics as such. I mean, one thing that has been clear, and whether you agree with this or not, it really doesn't matter, in terms of whether they should, is what I mean. But everyone will agree with this. The majority of the House of Commons, the vast majority of MPs in the House of Commons, if they were actually given a vote, if there had been no referendum, let's say the vote about whether to remain in the EU or not had been taken by MPs and there'd been no referendum, the overwhelming majority would have voted to stay within the EU. Politicians, British politicians, know that we are better in the EU than out. The only reason the referendum ever came about, not because there seemed to be some groundswell of public opinion as to why we should be in it, no. It was because the ruling party, the Conservative Party, has always been split pretty much down the middle, sometimes more one way than the other. And the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, said, look, if you'll shut up, I'll give you a referendum. Whereas what he actually should have said is, shut up, because if you don't, we'll split and then we'll lose the next election. But no, he wasn't strong enough to do that. But where it comes from, and it certainly has come over the years, what you notice when you're living in Britain, it's quite spectacular, is the anti-European sentiments in the British newspapers. We have this bizarre situation in Britain that doesn't seem to exist to the same extent in other countries. But obviously, I've not lived in other countries. I can only talk to people in other countries. Now, just as a little aside, we obviously know at the moment in America they've got this big problem because the current president, in order to just feed as much of the population as possible his version of events in his fantasy land, he attacks the press all the time. You know, he says they're bad, fake news, all the rest of it, in order to stir up resentment and mistrust of the media. And other people have said that actually a free press is absolutely essential to democracy, which it is. This is the issue. You cannot have government censoring the free press, the media, because journalists need to be able to tell the truth without fear or favour. So they're basically untouchable. Now imagine a scenario where in a country where rather than many of these newspapers wanting to just tell the public the truth, they wanted to change their views and put their truth into it. There's nothing to stop them. There's nothing to stop them. If newspapers publish something that is factually incorrect, and you don't need to publish something that's factually incorrect in order to get someone to believe something wrong. You can just present it in a very biased way to mislead. But they can present things that are factually incorrect, and there's almost no comeuppance. If they libel someone, then that person can take them to court, but that's an expensive process. You know. So they basically have free reign. And they have been many, not all newspapers, some are actually fairly responsible, but many newspapers publish the most inflammatory things as well. They don't even just produce misleading articles, they're very inflammatory. Take, for example, I can't point to it, rubbish, doesn't matter. Oh, Gordon Bennett on the the right hand side, enemies of the people. I'd be a terrible weatherman. I can't do it in reverse. That was the Daily Mail publishing something. What had happened is, in the wake of Brexit, the government were just basically wanting to run roughshod over the whole process. They wanted to arrange a deal and then just push it through without any consultations, without any information coming out, without any votes and all the rest of it. And someone said, no, you don't have the authority to do that. Because remember, in this country, the Prime Minister isn't like a president. You know, Parliament is, you know, effectively the government, you know, but you have this smaller part of it that takes responsibility for certain things, but they're not the power. Parliament is the power. So this person, you know, took this to the Supreme Court and said, look, we need to make sure the government behaves itself and follows all the correct democratic processes. And the judges found in favour of this person. And this newspaper immediately branded these judges enemies of the people. Now, I have to say, if you're, particularly if you're in America, you may, your own Supreme Court, for example, is very politically divided. It always seems to vote along political lines. You have a certain number of Republicans, which at the moment are the majority of that Supreme Court, certain number of Democrats. And that's why parties will go to extreme lengths to prevent, we had this recently, didn't we? When a new justice has to be appointed, they'll go to extreme lengths to make sure it's someone from their party, because they do not vote along lines of justice, they vote along those party lines. And party politics in America is so divided, it's unbelievable. In this country, judges, senior judges, are fiercely independent of government. They're all intelligent people, they all have their own politics, but they are absolutely fearlessly independent. They will not just find in favour of whatever is their political allegiance. They will find against the government when they need to. They will find in favour of the government. It really is a strength of the different strands of government. Our judiciary system, I'm not saying it's perfect, but bloody hellfire, they do not vote along biased political lines. They, you know, they are the very furthest thing from the enemies of the people. They're one of the last bastions of the people. So why was this newspaper doing it? Because it didn't like the verdict. The verdict wasn't to derail Brexit or anything like that. It was simply to say, the government, you've got legal processes you have to follow. This referendum doesn't give you carte blanche to do whatever you like. You know, you have a process to follow and you have to respect Parliament. And that's what it simply forced them to do. But why did the newspaper not like that? Because they knew that due process was likely to result in information getting out to the public showing that this isn't going to be great after all. The government would have liked nothing more than to have gone through this entire process, for this deal to have just gone through on the nod without any investigation at all, without any discussion, whether in public or whatever, or in Parliament. They wanted people to be completely clueless as to what the end result was going to be and just get it all through. And that's what the newspapers want as well, because they know that if there's full disclosure on everything, that people are eventually going to see the lies for the benefits of Brexit for what they are, which is exactly what's happened. But it's been coming a long time coming. You've got to remember, these newspapers are privately owned. Some of them by, you know, people who aren't even British, or certainly don't have the country's best interests at heart. You know, Rupert Murdoch is a major player in British media, for example. So, you know, they've been spitting this poison for decades. All my life, I've seen it. You know, whenever there's a football match between England and Germany, they always have to tell stupid World War jokes and make some World War II pun with regards to the Germans. They keep Germany the enemy, and actually the World War, or the World Wars, is another reason why Britain's attitude towards the EU is very different to the rest of the EU. See, for us, it's mostly about trade, a little bit of influence, but about trade essentially. Whereas the EU originally was set up, and of course it wasn't called the EU to begin with. It's gone through several names, but the body was initially set up to ensure, in the wake of World War II, that there could never again be war within Europe, or to at least try and avoid it, certainly between the major superpowers. Because for hundreds of years, Europe's at war with each other. For Europe, for many centuries, was the major developed continent in the world. It used to go, you know, we as Britain used to go around nicking countries all over the world, of course. We were the only ones who weren't silly enough to try and nick a country in Europe, because that's where it all went wrong. You know, France tried to conquer Europe, and Germany tried to conquer Europe, and ultimately where it fails is you're taking on multiple nations that are as developed as you. It's all going to end badly. But there was so many wars, and these wars weren't always between the same countries. You know, the different alliances changed all the time. So they said, look, this is silly. We need to stop warring amongst ourselves. It does us no good. So it was set up to bring themselves more political harmony. But it's that political harmony that we've rebelled against. And I think the reason is because Britain is the only country in Europe that hasn't in living memory been successfully invaded. And I think, you know, what adds to that opinion of mine is, if you look in some other EU countries, there are a number of other European countries now that place less emphasis on the political harmony aspect of the EU. And there's even parties in other countries railing against that themselves. And I think that's because the number of people who remember having their nations invaded has gone down. And as that population dwindles, and the younger people who've never known that, who've never known war, all of us, you take peace for granted. When you've had it for so long, you take it for granted. And, you know, those people then all of a sudden don't see the need for it. They'll think, well, we haven't had war for so long, therefore it's all fine. We don't need these arrangements. Not seeing that it's those arrangements that effectively stopped there being war. You know, so there's a certain element of that. So within Britain, we don't have people in this country going, you know, oh, okay, we still have a few people who can say how terrible the war was, but because we were never successfully invaded, we were attacked but not successfully invaded. We don't have people telling stories of how their town was under martial law with foreign soldiers walking up and down the streets or anything like that. We don't have that memory in a country, because the last time that happened was well outside of living memory. So that's another issue there. But yeah, over time, we have this weird situation of the sort of third aspect to it, I think, in this country, where we are far more likely to believe newspapers over politicians. Now, I'm not saying we should always believe politicians. I mean, we shouldn't automatically believe anyone. I always say what you need to do is consider someone's motive for saying what they're saying. Do they stand to gain from it? There was a situation in the early noughties where Dr. Wakefield, he's the guy who came up with this idea that there was a link between autism and the triple MMR vaccine, which even at the time was a clear nonsense. I could tell, as you know, someone who's a physics graduate and therefore can understand statistics, I could see that his conclusions were complete shambles. But more importantly, every doctor in the country said it was a nonsense. But here's the problem. Newspapers obviously they know that they sell newspapers with tragedy. Tragedy sells newspapers better than good news, right? Sometimes good news is so good that, of course, that's going to sell a few, like doing well in the World Cup. But by and large, tragedy is what sells it. And if there isn't a real tragedy, you'll make one up. So they cottoned onto this and they were going, oh, is this going to harm your child and blah, blah, blah. And the government and all the officials in the British Medical Council, all the rest of it, were all saying, no, this is safe. You need to have this. But a lot of people didn't. It wasn't just in this country either, because people are much, you know, in fact, almost made it worse, the government coming out and saying, no, this is safe. Because it's like, oh, government, oh, they're always lying to us. The newspapers tell us they always lie to us. But in this country, newspapers lie to us more than politicians. And yet people will believe the newspapers. People don't really mistrust newspapers. Their newspaper at any rate. And it's quite bizarre. There's lots of different newspapers and they all have their own character because they're all tailored to a very specific type of person. And that type of person will generally just read one or two newspapers that are echo chambers for themselves. And over time, of course, this feeds in. It's a bit like the quote from Hitler, isn't it? It says about telling a lie. He says, make the lie simple and keep saying it and eventually people will believe it. Well, this lie about the oppressive forces of Europe and, oh, Germany couldn't invade us with the military, so now they're doing it through political means, has been fed to British people who have no critical thinking, who don't bother to try and find things out outside of the information that comes to them via the Sun, which is like the worst of all, or the Daily Mail. And it's been fed to them for decades, to the point where they believe it, and they will make up stories sometimes because, as I say, they can really put a very misleading slant on anything at all and blow it out of proportion. And then you think to yourself, so why do politicians sort of follow this? For whatever reason, whether they think it's because the newspapers have enough sway to affect the decisions at the ballot box, who knows, maybe that's true. But it's certainly believed. I'll give you an example. In the last week, a few people have been entering the country illegally via boat, going across the channel, some people from Iran. This has been blown up into a major crisis. The Home Secretary had to cut short his holiday and come back to the country to deal with it and have crisis meetings. What's it, about a dozen people? There's thousands of people, British citizens, homeless this Christmas. That's not a crisis because the newspapers aren't on about that. You know, there's 1 million children in poverty. That's not a crisis because the media aren't on about it. A dozen Iranians come on a boat and land on a beach and they haven't got their passports. They're not supposed to be here. That's a crisis. That's a major crisis. And that's what has swayed public opinion and political opinion. They follow it's like the newspapers are the Pied Piper. And it's very destructive. And although, yes, a free press is essential to a healthy democracy, when that free press, the whole point of a free press is they have no real checks. They have voluntary codes they sign up to, especially when they have gone what has been seen to be too far. They're always going too far, in my view. For example, when the phone hacking scandal and all the rest of it, they had, you know, but even the code that resulted from that wasn't really legislated. It was a voluntary code because the governments do not have the guts to take on the newspapers. And in many ways, you know, it is a no-win situation because then what would happen is the newspapers would scream exactly what's happening in America, that this is an attack on a free press by a tyrant, a tyrannical government, because that's how they would make it seem. And of course, it's believable because in many countries, that's what you do. If you are an actual tyrant, you control the press. And that's why the press cannot be controlled by government, because it's anti-democratic. But when they don't have they don't accept responsibility for what they publish, that's when it all breaks down. You know, and I think that's what's led to this. The government, I'm not saying the government have been completely powerless. I think ultimately what the biggest problem is that the government do not in schools insist that we are taught proper skills. We're taught any number of subjects which the vast majority of the population will forget as soon as they've left school. Wasted their time. They might be able to read and write if you're lucky. Well, not lucky. Most people can read and write. But that's about it. You know, we don't teach them about financing. We don't teach them about politics. You know, most people don't even understand their political system. We don't teach them you know, about nutrition. You know, we don't teach them any number of things that everyone is going to need. And we don't teach them critical thinking. We do not teach the skills necessary to critically evaluate what someone is telling you. And the reason for that is because that hurts the government too. Because many politicians are voted into their positions based on the party machine being able to con people into doing it. So yes, it would massively rein in the worst excesses of the media if people reading those articles were critically thinking about it, but those people would use those same critical thinking skills to question their own politicians. And they don't want that. They don't want that. So that's my view as to, you know, the intricacies of British society that have sort of led to this situation. The fact of the matter is now, regardless of what happens, there is nothing that can happen now that will not deeply divide this country. It's a different process, but it's a very similar situation to what's happening in the United States, a deeply divided country. And there is no one interested that has the power to do so in bringing that country together. People keep talking about bringing the country together, but whenever people say that, what they actually are saying when you listen to what they say in their entirety is, and the way we bring people together is by this half of the country doing exactly what this half wants. That's not bringing the people together. That's telling half the country that it's their fault. And that's the situation we're in. And and there may not be an end to it. There may not be an end to it. Ever. Regardless of what happens. Who knows? But those are my thoughts anyway. Let me know what your thoughts are below, whether you live within Britain or outside of it, what your perceptions from the outside. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. Subscribe for further content. Click the bell notification to be notified of the further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.